Hello, Internet. It is currently 11 o'clock, give or take. Now I'm laying in my bed after a very long day and a very, very long work week, which means it's time for another bedside book review. Yes, I'm sticking with the gimmick. The book that I'm talking about tonight is A Bond Undone, which is the second volume of the English translation of Legend of the Condor Heroes by Jin Yong. Now, for those of you who don't know, Legend of the Condor Heroes is a super successful, super popular wuxia fiction series. To kind of explain the sheer terms of influence and ubiquity, Jin Yong is to the Chinese language entertainment sphere what Robert Howard or Richard Matheson or Philip K. Dick were to the English language entertainment sphere, very much in the same tradition of pulp writers, where these were serialized short stories that would appear in newspapers that were run by Jin Yong, real name Louis Cha. And so it very much is similar to a pulp novel in that regard. And wuxia stories, to kind of explain the genre a little bit, wuxia roughly translates to martial heroes, and as the name implies, it is very much a type of fiction centered around the martial arts, particularly people either training or fighting or trying to find secret techniques. It's very much kung fu fighting all the time. At least that's the idea. And some people may say it's kind of a fantasy genre. I would kind of say it's kind of in that weird, unique Venn diagram of fantasy, historical fiction, and action stuff because it follows the tradition of the Western here in the English speaking world, where it's set during an actual historical time period with actual historical details. I mean, the stories even feature people like Genghis Khan as a reoccurring character, but it very much is a case of okay, well, we're using this setting as more or less set dressing for cool stuff to happen. And so, yeah. When it comes to these stories, it is important to keep in mind that these were serialized because if you try to treat these as standalone novels, it can feel a little bit frustrating and it can feel like the story is a bit of a meandering mess. But when you consider that this is more of a collection of serialized short stories and not a novel in and of itself, it makes sense that things kind of meander a little bit because it's meant to be something that was read from week to week as you would pick up these newspapers. And when it comes to wuxia fiction, given that these stories were originally published in like the 1950s, you'll see a lot of tropes that already feel familiar if you're an anime fan in any regard, or if you're a fan of old school martial arts movies, because you'll see a lot of the same tropes where you have these long drawn out fight scenes and then you'll have a character unlocking a technique or figuring out some sort of secret where they somehow get a power up right out of nowhere, as well as having moments of long exposition where you have characters on the sidelines explaining how techniques work and explaining what's going on. And these stories are no different. And if you approach it with that kind of mindset, it can be pretty entertaining, even if some aspects of it haven't aged as well. Compared to other stories I've read from the 1950s and 60s, this at least holds up relatively well. When it comes to the translation, this one was translated by Gigi Chang, whereas the first volume was translated by Anna Holmwood. And one thing that I've noticed in the years it's taken me to finish this is why my copy is so beaten up, is there's something that people complained about when the translations were first being released that they're like, oh, they translated the Chinese names literally for us dumb Americans. But as I've come to learn, when it comes to the Chinese language, which is very much centered around pictographics, where the Chinese characters, one character can be one word, which is why you'll have some Chinese phrases that sound like just three words but are basically a complete sentence. And operating within this language, a lot of authors will use specific character choices to convey details about a character's background or a character's personality to the reader just in the name. And when I learned that fact, it suddenly made the choice to translate some of the character names literally make a little bit more sense. They're trying to preserve that storytelling mechanic where they're trying to convey something to the reader about who the character is in just the name and maintaining that nice subtlety to it. The strong example people often bring up when they were complaining about it is the character of Lotus Huang, who is the love interest of the main character, Bo Jing. And in English, she's written as Lotus Huang, whereas if you were to read it in the original Chinese or watch the multitudes of film and television adaptations, the name would be read as Huang Rong. But if you're when you approach this fact of, okay, they're trying to convey details about the character just in the name, we need to find a way to make that make sense to an English speaker who isn't going to be innately familiar with the Chinese language. I can actually respect those translation decisions. And so what initially bothered me when I read Volume 1 and finished reading it back in 2020, my mind has changed once I learned the little factoid. So, do I recommend Legend of the Condor Heroes? I'll simply say this. If you enjoyed films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or Zhang Yimou's Hero, or House of Flying Daggers, this is very much the types of stories that inspired those types of films. So if you want to get an understanding of where a lot of the tropes in a lot of martial arts movies came from, this would be a good place to start. But you'll definitely want to start with Volume 1, because these books, since they're part of a much larger serialized story, Volume 1 ends on a cliffhanger. This book picks up right where it leaves off and ends on another cliffhanger. And if you pace yourself and don't treat it as a self-contained novel and just kind of enjoy the journey of these serialized adventures, you'll have a good time with it. There's a good bit of action, good bit of comedy, and there are even times where you'll have a character that's introduced that the novel endears you to and makes you actually like, only for them to do something despicably horrible that makes you really, really hate them. At least that's how I feel about one particular character, Zhou Botong. I won't go into too much detail, but those of you who've read Legend of the Condor Heroes may understand why I may not particularly like that character by the time I finished the story. Or at least by the time I finished this volume. So, yeah, if you're a fan of classic martial arts films and you're wanting to get more into reading, I do recommend Legend of the Condor Heroes. I just need to actually sit down and get through the remaining 2 volumes, as well as the sequel, Return of the Condor Heroes, which has also been translated into English. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on it. I do recommend it, but definitely pace yourself with it. These were serialized separately. These weren't these volumes aren't just novels. They're basically collections of short stories that tell a larger story. And if you approach it with that mindset, you'll have a good time. So, yeah, those are my thoughts. I am struggling to stay awake, so I probably should go to bed. So, with that, I will see you all next time.